Now, next hear from Melinda St. Louis, who is the director of the Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. Since working alongside labor unions and farmer organizations in Nicaragua, fighting for fair trade policies, and more than 2 decades ago, St. Louis has developed deep expertise in trade and globalization issues and fought for progressive alternatives to corporate globalization that benefit people and the planet. She is a committed coalition builder, nurturing numerous global South-North coalitions, as well as broad and deep coalitions across the United States, working cross-culturally to build trust, plan together, and implement coordinated strategic actions to challenge power. Thank you for joining us, Melinda. I'm excited to hear from you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you all here tonight and to join our international partners and this fantastic panel. As you mentioned, my name is Melinda St. Louis, and I am the director of the Global Trade Watch Division at Public Citizen. It's a US-based consumer organization with 500,000 members and supporters, and we have advocated on behalf of the public interest for more than 50 years. Global Trade Watch has led the fight against corporate rigged trade agreements that provide special powers for big pharma to raise medicine prices, promote the outsourcing of jobs, and undermines food safety and other safeguards on which our families rely. We've been working to address the global COVID vaccine inequality through the trade policy lens, because in addition to funding and sharing technology, part of the solution to vaccinating the world is getting rid of intellectual property barriers at the World Trade Organization through what is called a TRIPS waiver. And the reason we need this TRIPS waiver, which is the agreement at the WTO on intellectual property, is that the World Trade Organization rules require countries to guarantee pharmaceutical corporations monopoly control, and this has meant long waits for production of generic medicines, which keeps medicine prices high around the world and increases in access to medicine. In the COVID-19 context, these intellectual property barriers have impeded global production of vaccines and contributed to the shameful reality that still only 15% of people in low-income countries have received their first shot. And we as a world will once again be ill-prepared to ramp up rapid production of newer generation vaccines targeting new variants, as well as life-saving treatments and diagnostics. That's why over 18 months ago, India and South Africa proposed a waiver of these intellectual property provisions called the TRIPS waiver to temporarily waive the barriers so that countries could produce their own COVID medical products. And there are dozens of facilities around the world that were ready to do so if only they were allowed. After a powerful campaign led by many of the people here at the People's Summit, President Biden announced support for the TRIPS waiver on vaccines last year. After the first global COVID summit in September of last year, the White House included support for delivering this TRIPS waiver and its pillar of commitments to vaccinate the world. But here we are, a year after the initial commitment, and we still have not seen a waiver at the WTO. What we have instead is a shocking counterproposal that was introduced at the WTO last week. This counterproposal is not a waiver. Instead, it clarifies existing options that countries already have at their disposal, which are not sufficient to actually be able to ramp up production. And it would even add new barriers to countries trying to bypass their intellectual property barriers. The only WTO member that signed off on this counterproposal is the European Union, and they have been spurred on by Germany that has been really carrying the water of big pharma corporations at the WTO. The EU and the WTO leadership are hoping to force countries to agree to this terrible proposal so that the WTO can claim to have done something to address the barriers that it created. And sadly, today at the summit, the WTO Director General called this counterproposal a workable solution, and when in fact, it would be a step backwards. But we will not be fooled. Civil society and experts from around the world agree that this counterproposal should be rejected in favor of a real, comprehensive TRIPS waiver that covers vaccines, treatments, and diagnostics. In addition to notable individuals like Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz and former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, organizations that oppose this counterproposal and are pushing for a real TRIPS waiver include public health organizations such as Doctors Without Borders, Oxfam, Partners in Health, the People's Vaccine Alliance, human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, labor organizations such as Public Services International, and very importantly, civil society and prominent academics in India and South Africa, the countries that are behind this original waiver proposal. The need to address these important intellectual property barriers was noticeably absent, unfortunately, today from the agenda of the summit, at the COVID summit today, which is very short-sighted, as world leaders claim to recognize the need to prepare for future strains of the virus and future pandemics. South African President Ramaphosa today used this opportunity to call for the TRIPS waiver to cover vaccine tests and treatments. We were very encouraged to see that. Indian Prime Minister Modi also called out the need to remove WTO intellectual property barriers in their statement at the summit today. It was disappointing that the White House did not include its previous commitment in its remarks or the fact sheet from today's summit, as this really would have been a critical moment to galvanize world leaders. We have less than a month before the biggest WTO meeting in years, so we really have to increase the pressure on the US to resist this counter proposal and to show leadership to get a real TRIPS waiver. And President Biden needs to update the US position to support a waiver for tests and treatments in addition to vaccines. The life-saving treatments now on the market for those who can get them are not yet available last year when President Biden announced his historic support for a vaccine waiver. So at this stage in the pandemic, tests and treatments are essential tools and must be included in a waiver. We have an easy tool that hopefully can be dropped in the chat to write to the White House on this. And I encourage you all to do this and share it with your friends and family. So if you can drop that in the chat. And speaking of the White House, I'd like to now share with you a video from international public health workers that Public Citizen, Be a Hero, and others projected at President Biden at the White House at a moving candlelight vigil ahead of this summit. We shared messages from these public health advocates from around the world, as well as a special video from human rights hero Adi Barkan reminding Biden of his personal promise to him to share the vaccine technology. So if you can roll that video.
My name is Tian Johnson from South Africa.
Soy Carolina Espinosa, trabajadora sanitaria en Chile.
I'm Gopakumar, legal advisor and senior researcher with the Third World Network.
President Biden, this pandemic is not over.
La pandemia no ha terminado.
We have been observing the discussions on TRIPS waiver since October 2020. President Biden, the world applauded you on May 5th, 2021.
El mundo le aplaudió cuando usted anunció el apoyo de los Estados Unidos a la exención para patentes de vacunas COVID-19.
We looked at you with hope when you stood up last year and supported a waiver of intellectual property barriers for COVID vaccines at the WTO.
A year later, the WTO has failed to deliver a meaningful waiver and global funding is drying up as millions of the people in the developing world continue to wait for their first shot and don't have access to new life-saving COVID treatments.
Across Africa, the continent I call home, we are yet to vaccinate even half of our healthcare workers. And many of our people have yet to receive even the first dose as the world moves on to a fourth booster shot.
Mientras tanto, algunos países siguen siendo títeres de las grandes farmacéuticas transnacionales.
Over a year later, as we brace for a fifth wave of death, illness, and the destruction of livelihoods in this region, the WTO has failed us by standing with farmers to put profits before lives, and global funding for the response is drying up. We face a future pandemic response grounded in charity instead of the justice we have demanded for the last 2 years.
President Biden,
President Biden,
cumpla su papel en asegurar una exención de derechos de propiedad intelectual que incluya vacunas, tratamientos y diagnósticos.
we need your leadership to secure a true TRIPS waiver.
It is also important to demand the US Congress to pass global funding to vaccinate the world and save lives.
Para vacunar al mundo.
To vaccinate the world and save lives now.
Well, thank you so much for your insights tonight, Melinda. I mean, the pandemic has really painfully laid to bear the structural inequalities that have made certain folks vulnerable and under-resourced, and certain folks easy to be resilient. And so just really appreciate your advocacy and your passion to addressing those underlying structural inequalities and systems of power.
Thank you so much. And I do encourage folks to please write to the White House. There also are a few links if you'd like to retweet that video. We really are trying to make sure that the president gets this message. This is very critical. In the next month, as I mentioned, before the World Trade Organization, we really need to see action now.
Thank you, Melinda.